The morphine wasn't working anymore. I could feel the exact moment it stopped. A white, hot blade twisting through my lower right abdomen, so savage that I bit through the inside of my cheek, trying not to scream. The hospital bed rails were cold under my hands as I gripped them, knuckles gone bloodless, while the monitors above me screamed numbers that sent 2 nurses sprinting into my room at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. "Mr. Jacob, your pressure is dropping." "Where is my wife?" I managed to say through clenched teeth. "Someone call my wife." The senior nurse, a heavy-set woman with kind eyes and the no-nonsense energy of someone who had seen everything twice, pressed a button on the wall panel and looked at me with the careful expression medical professionals reserve for patients they are genuinely worried about. "We've been trying her, Mr. Jacob. We'll keep trying. Right now I need you to focus on breathing slowly. I want to tell you I stayed calm. I want to tell you that I trusted everything was fine, that Rachel was probably just in a dead zone, that there was a reasonable explanation for why my wife of 6 years was unreachable while I was being rushed into emergency surgery with a ruptured appendix. I want to tell you I was that patient, that understanding, that generous. But even through the morphine haze and the agony shredding through my insides, something cold and quiet settled into the back of my mind, a knowing I didn't have words for yet, a door swinging open onto a hallway I hadn't known existed. I signed the surgical consent form alone. My hand was shaking so badly the signature looked like a seismograph reading. They put me under at 12:22 in the morning. Let me tell you about Rachel before I tell you what she did. Because you need to understand what I believed she was before you can understand what it meant when I found out what she actually was. I met Rachel at a company conference 8 years ago. She was in marketing, I was in project management, and she walked into that hotel lobby in a green blazer with her dark hair pulled back and a coffee in each hand. And she tripped over someone's laptop bag and sent both coffees flying and laughed so hard at herself that I fell completely in love with her in approximately 45 seconds. That was Rachel. She laughed at herself. She was warm and spontaneous, and she called her grandmother every Sunday without fail, and she cried at nature documentaries when animals died. We dated for 2 years. She met my parents, and they adored her. I met hers, and her father shook my hand and said, "You're a good man. Jacob, I can see it." We got married on a Saturday in September with her younger sister as maid of honor and my best friend Tom as my best man, and when she said her vows, she gripped both my hands so tightly that the rings pressed into my fingers, and she cried through the whole thing. I gave that woman everything. Not because she asked, because I wanted to. I worked 60-hour weeks so we could buy the house she loved in the neighborhood she'd grown up dreaming about. I learned to cook her mother's lasagna recipe because she got homesick. I gave up a job opportunity in Denver that would have doubled my salary because she didn't want to leave her city. I drove her to therapy appointments for 2 years when she went through her anxiety phase, and I sat in waiting rooms reading months-old magazines, and I never once made her feel like it was an inconvenience. When her college ex, a man named Derek, went through a divorce 2 years into our marriage and started texting her again, I didn't make a scene. I trusted her. She told me Derek was struggling, that he was in a dark place, that they'd been friends before they dated, and she felt responsible for him. She told me there was nothing romantic about it. She told me she loved me and I was being paranoid. I believed her. I swallowed every uncomfortable instinct I had because I believed in my wife. That was the thing about Rachel. She made you feel like doubting her was the problem, like your gut was the enemy. I was a fool, a loving, trusting, committed fool. And on the night my appendix burst and I was rushed into emergency surgery, that foolishness had consequences that I am still, even now, processing with a kind of white-knuckled fury. I woke up at 4:36 in the morning. The surgery had gone for just over 3 hours. The appendix had been perforated. The surgeon told me later it had likely been building for days, that the peritonitis was significant, that another hour without intervention would have moved the situation into genuinely critical territory. She used the word fortunate twice. She said I was fortunate the nurses had caught the pressure drop. Fortunate the surgical team had been available. Fortunate. I was lying in the ICU with 2 drainage tubes and an IV in each arm, and a catheter I won't discuss in detail, and I turned my head to the left, expecting to see Rachel sitting in the chair beside my bed. The chair was empty. I stared at it for a long time. My mouth was dry and tasted like copper and anesthetic. The monitors beeped. The ICU had that particular nighttime quiet that is not actually quiet. Machines and distant voices, and the specific hum of a building running on reduced staff. I asked the night nurse for my phone. She hesitated. I could see her weighing it, and then handed it to me. 11 missed calls from the hospital. 2 from Tom. 0 from Rachel. 0. There was 1 text from Rachel sent at 12:51 in the morning, nearly 30 minutes after they had wheeled me into surgery. I saw the missed calls. Is everything okay? I'm with Derek right now. He's having a really bad panic attack and I can't leave him alone. Call me when you can. Love you. I read it 4 times. I read it with drainage tubes in my abdomen and an IV in each arm, and the very fresh memory of signing a surgical consent form alone, because my wife had been unreachable. And what I felt was not sadness. It was not hurt. It bypassed all of that and landed somewhere much colder and much more final. I did not call her. I called Tom instead. He picked up on the second ring despite it being 4:40 in the morning, because that is who Tom is. And when he heard my voice, he said, "Jacob, what happened? I saw the hospital called." And I told him in the flattest, steadiest voice I have ever used that I'd had emergency surgery, and I was in the ICU and I needed him to come in the morning. And then I told him about the text. Tom was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, in the careful way he has when he is trying not to say something he actually desperately wants to say, "Jacob, I need to tell you something." I said, "Tell me." He told me. He had seen Rachel and Derek together 3 weeks earlier. Not texting, not a coffee between old friends. Together, at a restaurant across town, in a corner booth, her hand on his arm, their heads bent close in the way that people only lean together when the proximity feels earned. Tom had convinced himself he was misreading it. He had told himself it was nothing. He had spent 3 weeks telling himself it was not his place, and that he was probably wrong. Lying in the ICU at 4:40 in the morning with a ruptured appendix and my wife's absence sitting in the chair beside my bed like a physical presence, I felt the last piece click into place. "Thank you for telling me," I said to Tom. "Come in the morning. Bring coffee." I hung up. I put the phone face down on the blanket over my chest. I stared at the ceiling of the ICU for the rest of the night, and I made decisions in the dark with the clarity that only genuine, the uncomplicated fury can provide. Rachel arrived at 7:23 in the morning. She came in with a coffee cup in one hand and her bag on her shoulder, and she stopped in the doorway of my ICU room when she saw the tubes and the machines and the IV lines, and something crossed her face. Guilt, shock, the specific expression of someone who has just understood the scale of what they minimized. And she said, "Oh my God, Jacob." "Sit down," I said. She sat. Her eyes were filling. She reached for my hand and I moved it. "They called you 11 times, I said. "I know, I'm so sorry, 11 times, Rachel. While they were prepping me for emergency surgery, while I was signing the consent form alone, while they were putting me under." I kept my voice level. I had made a decision in the dark about how this conversation was going to go, and it was going to go calmly because I needed her to hear every word. "I woke up at 4:30 in the ICU, and the chair was empty, and you had sent me 1 text saying you couldn't leave Derek because he was having a panic attack. He was in a really bad state, Jacob. I was scared he was going to hurt himself." "He was having a panic attack," I said. "I had a ruptured appendix. I want you to hear those 2 sentences next to each other, and I want you to tell me you made the right call." She opened her mouth, closed it. "How long?" I said. The color drained from her face. "How long has it been more than friendship with Derek?" "Jacob? Don't." My voice came out harder than I intended, and I watched her flinch. I have 2 drainage tubes in my abdomen, and I have been awake all night making my peace with a lot of things. I am not in the mood for the version where you tell me I'm wrong. How long?" She put her coffee cup on the bedside table very slowly. She looked at her hands. And then, because Rachel, whatever else she was not capable of maintaining a lie when the evidence was already in the room, she broke. It had been 14 months. 14 months. It had started, she said, when Derek's divorce finalized, and he'd called her at 2 in the morning and she'd driven to his apartment because he sounded like he was falling apart. And something had happened that she'd told herself was a mistake, and then it had happened again. Daiso. And by that point, she'd made it into something she'd convinced herself she could manage and control, and eventually end without it ever touching us. I listened to all of it. I didn't interrupt. I let her talk until she ran out of words, and then I let the silence sit between us for a full 30 seconds. "He was having a panic attack last night," I finally said. "Yes. And I was in surgery." I didn't know how serious it was. I thought, "You thought what? That the hospital calls a number 11 times for something minor?" I shook my head. "You knew, Rachel. You knew it was serious, and you chose to stay with him anyway. And that tells me everything I need to know about how you've been weighing this for 14 months. She was crying properly now. The kind of crying that is also begging, that is also desperation. The kind that is designed, consciously or not, to make the other person pivot to comfort. I had spent 6 years being the person who pivoted to comfort Rachel when she cried. I did not pivot. "I love you," she said. "This was a mistake. Derek doesn't mean anything." "He means enough that you stayed with him while I was in surgery," I said. "He means enough that you made that choice without hesitating. Don't tell me he doesn't mean anything." "Jacob, please." "I need you to leave now," I said. "I need you to go home. And I need you to call your sister or your mother or whoever you need to call. But I need you out of this room. You can't be serious. You're in the ICU. And I survived the night without you. So I'll manage." I pressed the call button for the nurse. "Tom is coming. I have what I need. Please leave." She stood there for another few seconds. This woman I had loved completely and trusted absolutely, with tears running down her face and her coffee going cold on my bedside table. And then she picked up her bag, and she walked out. The nurse appeared in the doorway. I asked her to make sure Rachel was not put on my approved visitor list. She wrote it down without comment, with the quiet professionalism of someone who understood that not all ICU drama is medical. I lay back against the pillow and breathed through the pain, the physical pain, the other kind, and I started building the list. Tom arrived at 9 with coffee and a breakfast sandwich I couldn't eat yet, and the steady, uncomplicated presence of a man who has been your best friend for 15 years and knows when to talk and when to just sit. He sat with me for 4 hours. He didn't push. When I was ready to talk, I talked. He listened. When I told him I wanted a divorce, he nodded once and said, "Tell me what you need. I need to be clear about something." I was not acting out of hot emotion. The hot emotion had burned through in the night, alone in the ICU with nothing but monitors and ceiling tiles and the specific, clarifying agony of realizing that the person you built your life around had been quietly dismantling it for over a year. What was left by the time Tom sat down across from me was not rage. It was resolution. It was the cold, quiet certainty of a man who has done his accounting and knows exactly where he stands. I stayed in the hospital for 4 more days. During those 4 days, while Rachel sent 11 texts and 4 voicemails that I did not respond to, and showed up at the front desk twice, only to be turned away because I had made sure to have her removed from approved visitors, I used the time to do what needed to be done. I called my father on day 2. My father is a quiet, precise man who spent 30 years as a civil engineer and approaches every problem the same way, methodically, without sentiment, with complete attention to structural integrity, When I told him what had happened, he was silent for a moment, and then he said, "What do you need from me?" That was it. No lecture. No, "Are you sure?" No, "Have you considered?" Just, "What do you need?" I told him. He said, "I'll make calls today." My father had a college friend who was one of the most respected family law attorneys in the state. An appointment was set for the following Monday. My father also, without being asked. He began quietly moving through the financial architecture of my marriage, not illegally, not unethically, but with the careful attention of a man who understood that in situations like this, preparation was protection. He flagged things I should flag. He noted assets I should note. He did this because he loved me, and because he was built the way I was built, not to crumble, but to assess and act. On day 3, Tom drove across town to a restaurant where he knew Derek regularly had lunch. Tom is not a confrontational person by nature, but he is a loyal one, and loyalty in this case meant delivering a message on my behalf with the directness that the situation required. He sat down across from Derek and told him simply and without embellishment that I knew everything, that the affair had been confirmed, and that if Derek made any further contact with Rachel before the divorce was finalized, the next conversation would involve attorneys and a harassment filing. Tom said Derek went white as a sheet and couldn't finish his food. Good. On day 4, still in a hospital gown with drainage tubes in my abdomen, I composed a very careful, very specific email to my closest work colleague, a woman named Patricia who had always respected directness, informing her that I would be taking 2 weeks of medical leave following my discharge, and that I would be available for anything urgent via email. Patricia responded within 20 minutes with nothing but professionalism and well wishes, and I was grateful for the clean simplicity of a world where people behaved with basic decency. I was discharged on a Friday. Tom drove me home. Rachel had not been back to the house. She had gone to stay with her sister, based on the one text I had read from her sister's number before blocking it too. The house was exactly as I had left it 5 days earlier, when I had driven myself to the ER, because the pain in my side had become impossible to ignore. I walked through the front door and stood in the hallway for a moment, looking at 6 years of shared life arranged around me. The photographs, the furniture we'd argued pleasantly about, the kitchen where I had learned her mother's lasagna recipe. And I felt a deep, clean sorrow move through me like a weather system. Not weakness, not wavering, sorrow. Because I had loved this life, and it had been built on a foundation I hadn't known was compromised, and loving something and being done with it are not mutually exclusive. They can coexist. They were coexisting in me. As I stood in that hallway, I gave myself exactly 1 evening of grief. 1 evening of sitting in my kitchen with a glass of water and the specific silence of an empty house, and letting myself feel the full weight of it, the 14 months, the hospital calls she hadn't answered, the empty chair in the ICU, all of it. I felt it completely because I knew that feeling it completely once was the only way to move through it cleanly. Then I went to bed. Then I woke up the next morning. Then I began. The attorney my father connected me with was a man named Gerald Hawes, and he was exactly what I needed. Precise, unsentimental, and extraordinarily competent. He reviewed everything I brought him in the first meeting, and said, "Well," in the measured tone of a man who had seen every version of this story, "You've been thorough. That's going to make this efficient." Efficient was what I wanted. The divorce papers were filed within the week. Rachel was served on a Thursday afternoon at her sister's apartment. Tom had a friend who knew the process server, and Tom made sure I was informed the moment it was done. He texted me 2 words. "She's served." I was at the gym when I got that text. Tom, I was 6 days post-discharge, and probably shouldn't have been doing anything more strenuous than walking. But my surgeon had cleared light activity, and I had decided that my body needed movement the same way my mind needed action, and I was on the rowing machine working through the kind of slow, methodical effort that clears everything else out. I read Tom's text, set the phone face down, and finished my session. The divorce papers were not the only thing filed that week. I had taken careful stock of our financial situation during my hospital stay and discovered, with the help of my father's methodical flagging, that Rachel had been making cash withdrawals from our joint savings account over the previous 8 months in amounts small enough not to trigger automatic notices, but significant enough to add up. $14,000 in total. I did not know what the money was for. I had a strong suspicion involving a man named Derek, who had been going through a financially destabilizing divorce and needed support from someone. I could not prove the destination, but I could document the withdrawals, and Gerald Hawes used them with precision. Though, Rachel's attorney, a woman who called Gerald twice in the first week trying to frame the withdrawals as household expenses Rachel had managed independently, was informed in clear terms that we had itemized records of actual household expenses for the same period, and that the math did not support that characterization. That line of argument was dropped. Meanwhile, I called a locksmith and had every lock in the house changed. I compiled a box of Rachel's personal items, clothing, books, the small things she'd care about, and arranged through our attorneys for her to retrieve it at a scheduled time when I would not be present. I was not doing this to be cruel. I was doing it because having her in the house while I was also in the house served no purpose except pain for both of us, and I had decided to do this whole process with a minimum of pointless pain. But I was also done protecting her reputation at the expense of truth. Her parents had always liked me. Her father, especially. The man who had shaken my hand at that first meeting and said, "You're a good man." He had meant it, and I had believed it. And I had spent 6 years trying to be worthy of the assessment. When I called him, I did not do it to hurt Rachel. I did it because he was a man who deserved the truth about why his daughter's marriage was ending, rather than whatever version Rachel would construct for him. I told him everything, calmly, completely. I told him about Derek, about the 14 months, about the hospital calls, about the chair that had been empty in the ICU. Her father was silent for a long time, and then his voice, when he spoke, was thick with something I recognized as shame, not for himself, but for what his daughter had done. "I don't know what to say to you, Jacob," he said. "You don't have to say anything," I told him. "I just wanted you to know the truth." "You're a good man," he said again. "I meant that when I said it." "Thank you," I said. "Take care of yourself." I hung up and sat with that for a while. It wasn't satisfaction exactly. It was something quieter. The clean feeling of a man who has behaved with integrity in circumstances that would have justified less. The next call was harder. Not emotionally harder. Harder in the sense that it required more deliberate precision. Derek's ex-wife had moved back to the city after their divorce finalized. She had, through the small social mathematics of mutual acquaintances, ended up in the orbit of a few people Tom and I knew. Tom had quietly established that she did not know the full story of why her marriage had actually ended. She had believed, as Derek had let her believe, that the divorce was the result of mutual deterioration and incompatibility. Gerald Hawes confirmed that what I was planning was not legally actionable, as long as I was sharing truthful information and not making demands or threats. I was not interested in demands or threats. I was interested in truth. I wrote a carefully composed message to Derek's ex-wife. I identified myself, explained my connection to the situation, and told her plainly what Tom had witnessed and what Rachel had confirmed. That the relationship between Rachel and Derek had been ongoing throughout the final period of her marriage. I included nothing speculative. I included nothing inflammatory. I stated facts, noted that she deserved to have them, and told her I was sorry for the circumstances. She responded 2 days later with a message that was brief and composed and contained one sentence I have thought about often since. "I spent a year wondering what I had done wrong." That sentence cost Derek considerably more than he had calculated when he decided to involve himself with a married woman. Within 2 weeks of that message, The professional reference Derek had been quietly relying on, a former colleague of his ex-wife who had been helping him navigate his post-divorce career transition, was no longer available to him. I did not engineer this. I did not need to. Truth, released into the correct ecosystem, moves on its own. The divorce took 4 months to finalize. They were 4 months of the most productive, most intentional living I had done in years. I went back to work after my medical leave, and I worked with a focused intensity that my department head noticed within the first week. There was a regional director position that had been quietly discussed for 18 months, the kind of role that requires someone to demonstrate sustained reliability and strategic vision over time, the kind of role that does not go to someone whose personal life is visibly in crisis. I made sure my personal life was not visibly in crisis. I was steady. I was sharp. I was the person in every room who had clearly decided something about himself. The position was offered to me at the end of month 3. I accepted it. I also, during this period, went back to something I had let go of in my marriage without quite realizing I was letting it go. I had been a serious amateur runner before Rachel and I got together. Half marathons, 1 full marathon, the specific discipline of training your body to keep moving past the point where it wants to stop. It had dropped away gradually as the demands of married life reorganized my priorities, and I had told myself I didn't miss it. I had missed it. 6 weeks post-surgery, cleared by my doctor for progressive activity, I started running again. Not racing, just running. Early mornings before the city was fully awake, moving through streets that were quiet and mine. The body remembers. The lungs remember. By month 2, I was running 8 miles on Saturday mornings without stopping, and something in me that had been compressed and tight for a long time was beginning to open back up. Tom noticed. "You look different," he said one evening over dinner. "Different how?" "I don't know. Like someone turned the lights back on." I understood what he meant. There is a particular dimming that happens when you spend years in a relationship that is not fully honest, when part of you is always, at some subterranean level, working to compensate for a dissonance you can't name. I had not known the lights were dimmer. I had not known until they came back on. Rachel tried 3 more times to reach me during those 4 months. Once through her sister, once through a mutual friend named Claire, who I'd always liked, and who seemed genuinely conflicted about being used as an intermediary, and once in a voicemail from Rachel's own number that I did not block because Gerald Hawes had advised me to keep a record of all contact. I listened to the voicemail once. She said she had made a catastrophic mistake. She said she didn't expect forgiveness. She said she just needed me to know that she understood what she had done, and that losing me was what she deserved. I saved the voicemail as documentation and did not respond. I was not being heartless. I was being honest with myself about what responding would accomplish, which was nothing good for either of us. She was not asking for information. She was asking for absolution, or at minimum for connection, for the confirmation that I still existed in relation to her, that she was still real to me in a way that warranted engagement. I understood the impulse. I also understood that providing that confirmation would be a kindness to her that was an unkindness to me, and I had spent enough time making that particular trade. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday. Gerald Hawes called me at 2 in the afternoon and said, "It's done," and I said, "Thank you?" Gerald." And I sat at my desk for a moment and felt the formal closure settle into place. Then I went back to work because there was a project deadline on Friday and my team needed me present. That evening I called my father. He asked how I was doing, not procedurally but actually, in the way he had been checking in every week since the hospital. I told him I was well. I told him I was genuinely, honestly well. He said, "Good, that's all I wanted." 4 months after the divorce was finalized, I ran my first race since 2019. A half marathon on a cool November morning with a field of several hundred people and the particular democracy of a starting line where everyone is, for a few hours, just a person doing a hard thing, I finished in 1 hour, 41 minutes. Not my best time ever. Better than I had any right to expect 8 months after abdominal surgery. Tom was at the finish line with a coffee and that grin he has when he is proud of someone and doesn't want to make it weird. I crossed, stopped my watch, bent over with my hands on my knees for a moment, and then stood up straight. "How do you feel?" Tom asked. "Like someone who just ran 13 miles, I said. Then, "Good, I feel good." And I meant it in a way that was larger than the race. The regional director role had formalized by then. My salary had increased significantly. I had moved out of the house, I sold it, split the equity as required by the settlement, and bought a smaller place that was entirely mine. Furnished and arranged according to my own preferences without negotiation or compromise, which sounds like a loss, but feels, I will tell you honestly, like an extraordinary luxury. My bedroom faces east. I wake up to the sun. Nobody has an opinion about my coffee maker. I was not in a hurry to date. Some people, after the end of a marriage, need to fill the space immediately. Need the confirmation that they are still desirable, still capable of connection. I understood that impulse and I did not share it. I was complete on my own in a way I was still discovering, and I didn't want to shortchange that discovery by moving through it too fast. I had a full life. I had Tom and a widening circle of people who had chosen me for who I was, rather than for what I provided within a particular structure. I had my runs and my work, and a Wednesday night dinner with my parents that I had reinstated after years of it falling away. I was not lonely. I was solitary, which is a different thing entirely. I heard about Derek secondhand through the natural movements of overlapping social worlds. Tom mentioned it not as gossip, but as plain information he thought I should have. Derek had lost his job. Not dramatically, not in a scene, but in the quiet, grinding way that happens when a person's professional reputation sustains damage in an industry where reputation is currency. The reference networks had not been kind. He was freelancing, struggling, and had apparently tried to reconnect with Rachel at some point in the previous months, only to discover that Rachel, confronted with the reality of who he was when stripped of the drama and the need and the secrecy, had found him considerably less compelling. Rachel, from what Claire had mentioned in a brief conversation we'd had at a mutual friend's birthday, brief, warm, without subtext, Turnen, because Claire was a decent person who was not interested in drama, was doing the difficult work of reckoning with herself. She was in therapy. She had moved to a different part of the city. She was not with Derek. She was, by all accounts, quietly and painfully paying the price of understanding yourself through the wreckage you leave. I did not take pleasure in this. I want to be clear about that because it matters. I had wanted consequences. I had pursued them strategically and deliberately, but consequences arrived, and they did not feel like victory. They felt like the natural weight of choices settling onto the people who made them. Justice is not always triumphant. Sometimes it is just gravity. I ran into Rachel exactly once, 8 months after the divorce was finalized. It was at a coffee shop near my office, the kind of accidental collision that cities specialize in, regardless of how carefully you rearrange your geography. She was ahead of me in line. I didn't see her until she turned with her cup and we were 3 feet apart, and there was nowhere for either of us to gracefully go. She looked tired, not destroyed. She had always been someone who took care of herself, and that hadn't entirely changed. But there was something in her face that hadn't been there before, a kind of settled weight around the eyes that I recognized as the long-term evidence of genuine regret. She looked at me, and I looked at her, and I saw in her expression the rapid calculation of a person deciding whether to speak or let the moment pass. And before she could decide, I said quietly and without drama, "Hi, Rachel." "Jacob," she said. Her voice was careful. "You look well." "I am well," I said. Not as a performance, not to wound her, as a simple statement of fact. She nodded. She looked down at her cup and then back up at me, and I could see there were about 10,000 things she wanted to say. Could see the weight of them pressing against the inside of her expression. And she said none of them, because whatever Rachel had learned about herself in the previous year had apparently included the understanding that some things had no available response. "I'm glad," she said finally. And she meant it. I could hear it. And that was perhaps the most complicated moment of everything that had happened. To be looked at by the person who had hollowed out your life, and to see in their face that they were genuinely glad you had rebuilt it. "Take care of yourself," I said. The same thing I had said to her father. I meant it both times. I got my coffee. I walked back to my office in the November light. I had a meeting at 2 and a run scheduled for 6, and dinner with Tom on Friday, and parents on Wednesday. And my life was organized around things that were real and chosen, and mine. I thought about the night in the ICU, the empty chair, the monitors beeping, and the ceiling I had stared at in the dark while I built decisions out of fury and pain. I thought about the nurse who had handed me my phone with that careful expression. I thought about signing the consent form alone. I thought, that was the night my actual life began. Not the one I had been living, the one I had been believing in, the one I had been faithful to while it quietly ran parallel to something else. My actual life. The one built on things I knew to be true. Some men, when the ground falls out beneath them, fall with it. They spend years in the rubble, in the resentment, the diminishment, the grief that curdles into bitterness and stays. I understand how that happens. I felt the pull of it. In the dark of the ICU with 2 drainage tubes and an empty chair, I felt the specific gravity of a man who could let this destroy him. I chose not to. Not out of nobility, out of self-respect. Because I was a man who had loved honestly and worked hard and trusted completely, and none of those things were failures. The failure belonged to someone else. I was not going to carry it. 6 years, 14 months of betrayal, 11 unanswered hospital calls, an empty chair in the ICU, and then a new lock on a new door, a half marathon in November, a promotion. My father's voice on the phone saying that's all I wanted. Tom at the finish line with coffee. The sun through an east-facing bedroom window. I never thought about Derek again. Not in any way that cost me anything. Not in the way that meant he still had weight. I thought about Rachel sometimes. In the neutral way you think about a place you lived for a long time and no longer live in, with a kind of distant recognition that it shaped you and a clear certainty that you are no longer there. I was somewhere better. I had built it myself. In the long, quiet, methodical way that a man builds something meant to last, stone by stone, starting from the night I lay in that hospital bed alone and understood with absolute clarity exactly who I was and exactly what I was worth. I was finally, completely, irreversibly free.